A while back, I was looking out the window in my studio and I saw thick black smoke pouring past the window, and then I heard a boom. I went to another window to get a better view of what was going on, and not too far from my house, there was an old abandoned house that was fully engulfed in flames. And within a couple of minutes, the whole structure had burned down. As you can see from these pictures here, the fire department was on the scene right away, and they took care of the blaze within a few minutes. And I actually found out that it seems like this was some sort of practice run where the fire department was given permission to burn down the abandoned house and practice putting it out. Now, this isn't the first time that a building is burned down in town, of course. Any American town that's more than 100 or so years old has probably seen multiple major fires, and my town is no different. All the buildings are made of mostly wood, and wood burns really well. And in this town, they've had multiple major fires in history that have burnt down large chunks of the town, and they've been subsequently rebuilt. I was reading about the history of the town a bit, and there was a particularly large fire in 1903 that started at a meat market on what is now the main street of the town. And the fire spread quickly, and it burned down a lot of buildings on Main Street and surrounding areas. And the fire was so big that they actually sent down a pumper truck to pump water to try and fight the fire. They sent it down from Richmond to help with the control of the fire, but when it got down here, it turned out that the water here in town was too salty to use for the pumper truck, and so it ended up being useless. A few years before that big 1903 fire, the town had looked into getting its own water supply so that it could fight fires, and the whole apparatus that we're used to now with fire hydrants that fire trucks can hook up to spray water onto fires, that takes a lot of work and a lot of money. And back in the late 1800s, the town decided that was just too expensive. And it actually took a couple of big fires before the town was convinced that they should spend the money to actually take the trouble. That fire in the early 1900s was fought with bucket brigades, with people just lining up with buckets and trying to throw water on the fires one bucket at a time, and people tearing down fences and buildings in the path of the fire to try and create breaks so that the fire wouldn't spread from building to building, because all the buildings were huddled pretty close together. But it really didn't work. None of those efforts really worked to stop the fire. I read in a town history here that there was one lady who soaked a bunch of quilts and blankets and put them on her house, and she was trying to stop the fire that way, and that didn't work either. The house burned up, and she lost all of her blankets too. That big fire also turned out that a few days afterward, that a guy came into the police department and said that he had started the fire, and so they took him into custody, and word got around town that this guy had admitted to starting this fire that had burned up most of the town, and there were so many people that gathered outside of the jail that they thought that they were going to break in and lynch him or something. And so they put him on a train and said that they were taking him up to Richmond to keep him in custody there so that the townspeople couldn't get to him. But it turns out they just took him a little ways out of town on the train line and then had him stay at a house that night. And then when he woke up in the morning, he sobered up, and he said that he actually hadn't started the fire, but he was just drunk and talking nonsense, and there wasn't any evidence that he had actually started the fire, so they let him go. But anyway, so I guess the point here is that a lot of these things that we take for granted, like our water towers and all the pipes underneath the ground and all the fire hydrants and stuff, that stuff sort of is just part of the background, and we kind of forget about all the work and sacrifice that it takes to keep all that stuff running, and how difficult life is without that sort of convenience and without all of that infrastructure in place. And so I thought about that a lot as I was working on this painting of the town water tower. So yeah, let's talk about the painting itself. This is my third ever oil painting, and my goal here was to take it very slow, very deliberate. I didn't want to rush, and I wanted to take whatever time was necessary to get it right. And so it ended up taking me way longer than I expected. And part of that was just that there were a lot of techniques here that I had just never tried before, like just a lot more blending of colors from one shade to another than I've ever tried before. Some sort of rounded and spherical forms, like the bottom of the water tower, that type of spherical form, and trying to convey that and make it look three-dimensional even though I'm painting on a two-dimensional surface. That was tricky. And I think the number one thing that took so much time here was just that there were so many long, thin sections, like long, thin, straight lines, parallel to each other, crossing each other, converging at various angles, which created so many different areas where I had to just creep along millimeter by millimeter to get the lines straight, or at least as straight as I could manage, and keep them thin. It's so easy for me, like as I'm painting, like my hand just naturally wants to make a kind of curvy, wobbly line, and it wants to make it thick in some places and thin in other places. So the idea of this composition that's full of these extremely thin, consistent, mechanical, man-made type structures, as opposed to something that's just kind of flowing and bushy, it took a lot of time and a lot of intense concentration. And here's another thing that I was trying for the first time, never done before, is painting letters. Everybody knows what the alphabet looks like. They know whether a letter looks correct or not. And here I'm trying to reproduce these precise, very rectilinear letter forms on the water tower. And so that also was something that I had never done before. So it took me a little bit of trial and error. How do you get these letters properly spaced? How do you get them to follow along a curve? Because the surface of the water tower is curved. And then as I'm working through it, I'm trying to remember the instructions and the steps that I learned from Mark Carter's instruction, starting to work from dark into light. And this painting seemed to have a ton of darks. It was such a relief once I got to the tree, or I guess there are two trees here, like painting the trees and painting the trees. That was the fun part of it, because they didn't have to be so precise and so meticulous. I'm sure I could have done more to make the tree match my reference photo more closely. I did notice that the tree that I painted had a lot more gaps and spaces where the light was shining through than the actual tree in the photo. So I think my tree looks a little bit more sparse and scraggly than the real tree, which is kind of a bummer. Something else that was a challenge all throughout was that all of these long, thin, straight lines, they actually had a lot of variation in their thickness and in their color as they travel along. Some of these cross ties that sort of secure the water tower structure, they change color from light to dark depending on where they are in the where the light is hitting them along their length. And then the power lines are a different thickness than the structure braces on the water tower. But in the end, my paintbrush and just my technique isn't quite sophisticated enough to get all of those variations as faithfully as I would have liked. So a lot of the lines, even though in real life they're different thicknesses in the reference photo, they end up being about all kind of the same thickness. And then even though I tried to reflect that the lines change color as they move, or as the light hits them in different spots, once I put the background color up against them, then a lot of them just look like black lines regardless of what I started out with. And as I was working on these interior spots here within the tower, it almost felt like stained glass, because I'm filling in like one little section at a time and trying to be careful not to paint over the border lines. And with the sort of black borders in between them, it was really fun. And then I was trying to get this gradation of the sky. I took the photo that is the reference photo at sunset. That's why the bottom of the water tower kind of has that gold hue to it. And the sky was sort of a blue towards the horizon. And then as you moved up the water tower, it was kind of purplish. And then up near the top of the water tower, it sort of faded back to a different blue. And so I'm trying to convey all of that gradation of color through the sky, but it's also being bisected and intersected with all of these cross lines all throughout. So maintaining some sort of consistent color blending, all of this was, I feel like, a bit above what my skill level was ready for as far as like this being the third painting that I've ever done. But again, I just was taking my time. There was no rush to finish this by any particular deadline. And so I just tried to move segment by segment and be methodical about it and not beat myself up too much about mistakes as I went along, because that's one of the great things about oil painting that I'm learning, is that the way it stays wet for a long period of time, it gives you more of a chance to correct your errors as you go. And as I was getting closer and closer to finishing, I was getting more and more excited, and that was part of the challenge, is to keep pacing myself. But in the end, it's finished, and I feel like I did the best that I could do based on my skills at this point, and I am excited to start the next one. But I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed the little story at the beginning, but let me know what you think in the comments. Anyway, I appreciate you watching. Take care.